So the work that I'm going to be presenting today is the result of an invitation to my advisor to submit an article to a special issue of Biological Invasions that was titled Ecology, Biology, and Management of the World's Worst Plant Invaders. And the idea for it came from some lab members and myself just thinking about some of the changes that we were seeing at some of our field sites throughout New Jersey. And so the title of the paper is The Perfect Storm, Two Ecosystem Engineers Interact to Degrade Deciduous Forests of New Jersey. And to start, change slide. To start, I would like to just define what ecosystem engineers are. And so they're organisms that create or modify habitat within an ecosystem.
Wait,
and so this...
I'm sorry. Technological... Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Are we
getting there? Okay. Now, how do I go to the next one? Down, okay. I hit enter instead of down. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. So everyone's the ecosystem engineer slide?
Yep, here we go.
Okay. So again, I just wanted to define ecosystem engineers, which was a concept come up with by Dr. Clive Jones from the Institute for Ecosystem Studies. And so these are organisms that create or modify habitat within an ecosystem. And so their effect depends on the lifetime per capita activity of the individual engineering organism, the population density of the engineer, which we're going to come back to later and is going to be really important in the context of this talk, the spatial distribution of the engineer population, the length of time the engineer population has been at a site, the type, formation rate, and the durability of the impact stemming from the engineer, and the types of resources and the number of other organisms that are directly or indirectly controlled or impacted by the engineer. Change slide. And so many ecosystem engineers are essential for maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And so here are two classic examples. The first is the beaver, which by building dams creates a diverse wetland habitat that would not exist without its engineering of these dams. And the second example is Lepidoptera larvae, which build these shelters with their silk threads, and this creates a high diversity of herbivores within these modified structures. Change slide. It's important to understand that not all ecosystem engineers have a positive effect on native biodiversity. One such example is kudzu, which is an invasive plant species of the southeast United States, and it smothers native vegetation and reduces the amount of light that gets to the forest floor, reducing the abundance and the diversity of native saplings in the understory. Change slide. One of the ecosystem engineers we'll be looking at today is the white-tailed deer. Change slide. White-tailed deer exist at overabundant population densities throughout North America. And so it's been suggested that greater than 4 deer per kilometer squared is overabundant number of deer and can cause overbrowsing. And so many areas of North America have higher deer abundances than this. And this is due to many reasons. One is loss of apex predators. The other is reduction in hunting. And then the other reason is increased winter forage through just suburban shrubbery or as well as fields that are left fallow or just foods that are left over from agriculture out in the fields throughout the winter. When deer are overabundant, they have been shown to extirpate drought-sensitive plant species, decrease forest-dwelling invertebrates, and alter forest bird communities. Next slide. Invasive plant species also have the capacity to act as ecosystem engineers. And so we all know that invasive species are being distributed further and more frequently than they have at any point in Earth's history. And they represent a huge threat to native species and ecosystems. And this threat can be magnified when the invaders are ecosystem engineers. And so some engineering invasive plants have shown the ability to alter soil-based ecosystem processes, like this Japanese barberry that's in the picture that's on the left. Water availability in the soil, and that's an example of that is the tamarack species, which has invaded the arid desert southwest region of the United States. And invasive plants also change the structure of communities. Next slide. The same conditions that promote overabundant deer populations also facilitate non-native plant species invasions in the eastern deciduous forest. And so both white-tailed deer and many invasive plant species benefit from the matrix of habitats that are fragmented in the fragmented eastern deciduous forest. And so when we think of our eastern deciduous forest, and what are they fragmented by? They're fragmented by roads, they're fragmented by agricultural fields, and suburbs. And so this plays into increasing deer populations by more winter forage in suburbs, agricultural lands, as well as a reduction in hunting, because when there's suburbs, you can't, there's a decrease in hunting because there's less area that you can hunt over. There's more refuges for the deer, as well as the fact that fragmented habitats support less apex predators, because large predators need large contiguous habitat in order to survive. And for invasive plants, a lot of invasive plants disperse along roadways and disturbed habitats, and agricultural fields as well as suburban developments are areas where sources of invasive propagules can disperse along roads and into forest interiors. In addition, Hobbs provides evidence that ungulates could serve to increase the prevalence of a co-occurring non-native invader. So this can happen through selective foraging. So if the deer species specifically eat native species and don't eat the invasive, that could increase the abundance of invaders, as well as ungulates can disperse propagules of invasive plants into forest interiors, either by eating them and defecating them out or on their hooves and fur. And finally, the positive effect of deer on invasive plants can also extend to the alteration of resources that favor the invasive. An example of that is white-tailed deer thinning the shrub layer and allowing more light to reach propagules of invasive plants that are on the forest floor that normally would not get the light that is necessary to establish. So where does this leave us? This leaves us to New Jersey, which is the most densely populated state in the Union, has the most Superfund sites, and is also home to the famous New Jersey Turnpike. New Jersey forests experience overabundant deer populations. An example of this is that, as I said earlier, it's considered overabundant deer populations if there's more than 4 deer per kilometer squared. Well, the minimum average in 1999 in New Jersey counties was 14 deer per kilometer squared, and 1 kilometer squared in Huntington County had 82 deer within it. New Jersey forests are also subject to non-native plant invasions, and when one of these invasive plants is an ecosystem engineer, 2 strongly interacting species can combine to greatly alter the ecosystem in the invaded habitat. Change slide. So the invader that we're going to be looking at today, although you could easily put in your own favorite invader or not favorite invader, is Microcygum biminum, or Japanese silkgrass. It's a shade-tolerant annual C4 grass that was introduced to the U.S. From Japan and China. Silkgrass was first detected in 1919 in Knoxville, Tennessee, and in less than 100 years has invaded from Florida to Massachusetts. It first arrived in New Jersey in 1959, but it's only become invasive in the last 20 years. Can I just check to make sure that we're on the same slide, Leslie?
Ben, we're on the right slide, but could you tell us what C4 grass means?
It has to do with the photosynthetic pathway of the plant. So there's C3 and C4 grasses. I'm not a plant biologist, and we'll get to my favorite part of this interaction, which is the birds. But that's as far as I can go into it. It has to do with the photosynthetic pathway that that the plant uses. Next slide. Some other aspects of Microcygum, or Japanese silkgrass, that make it a really good invader and ecosystem engineer is that it thrives in disturbed areas such as roadways and forest edges. It's shade tolerant. It forms dense monospecific stands that outcompete native seedlings, and it produces copious amounts of seed that remain viable in the seed bank for up to 3 years. It has also been shown to alter soil-based ecosystem processes, and deer do not eat it. And I don't know how many of you have been out working with Microstygium, but I really haven't found any evidence of herbivory on it at all whatsoever. And so I'm not sure if there's anything that eats it around here. And so maybe some of you guys who have been working, if you've worked with this invasive species, can let me know what you've seen. But what results after invasion is this, as you can see in this picture, is a crouching tiger, hidden dragon forest that, you know, may look nice, but certainly functionally and is a lot different than a native understory. And so that brings us to one of my study sites, which is Hutcheson Memorial Forest. And so not all areas of New Jersey are off the turnpike. There are actually many beautiful areas in New Jersey, and one of them is this forest, which is located in Somerset County in the Piedmont region. It's a mixed oak hickory forest with 26 hectares of old growth surrounded by secondary forests, old fields, and farm fields. And it's actually the site of the longest running succession study in the U.S., possibly in the world. It's the dual succession study, which has been running for 5 years. And so if you can see, kind of just on the edges of the forest are a whole bunch of successional fields that have been disturbed at different times. So now, this picture is from 1976, so right along the edges of the forest at the bottom of the picture are all juniper and old field stands. So it's a really interesting Rutgers research forest. And also, it's also one of the last uncut forests in the mid-Atlantic states. And so the forest has changed dramatically over the past 50 years that it's been studied. And some of the main threats to it are overabundant deer populations and invasive plant species. And so when we look at picture A and picture D, picture A is from 1976 and picture D is from 1968. And they show a healthy, intact understory. And the picture D is a little earlier than all the other pictures, so this is showing a lot of mayapple. And when you look at pictures B and C, you can see that there's a heavy browse line. You can see clear through the forest. And what's left is either in picture B, Microstygium, and in the foreground there's garlic mustard, or just plain leaf litter with a little bit of Microstygium, as you can see in picture C. And although this isn't a picture in May, so you wouldn't know if there were or weren't mayapples there, I can tell you that it's very rare to find a mayapple within the forest. And so we can see that, you know, this looks, at least to our eye, very, very different habitats. And so the question is, how did the other organisms that are in the forest perceive their habitat, or how does it change the diversity of organisms that inhabit this forest? Specifically birds, because that is what I like to study. And so next slide. And so we have so this is a slide with two schematic diagrams on it. Are we there?
We're good, Ben.
Okay, sorry about that. I thought I missed one. Schematic A is just a direct interaction with the factors that affect breeding birds. And so we're going to look at the forest structure. And so this is how birds perceive their surroundings and where they place their nests. And then the invertebrate community, which are the prey items that these birds will eat and feed their young while they're breeding. And so in scenario A, overbrowsing, plant invasion, and fragmentation directly have negative effect on these factors, which has been documented, and affect the populations of breeding birds. In scenario B, it's kind of our perfect storm hypothesis, where these different factors interact to increase the negative effects on the bird community. And so you can see the size of the arrow gives the idea of how large the effect is. And so with predator release increasing overbrowsing, as well as fragmentation increasing overbrowsing, overall overbrowsing has a larger negative effect on breeding birds. And then with overbrowsing affecting plant invasion and fragmentation also affecting plant invasion, this increases the negative effect on the factors that affect breeding birds as well. And so in light of this, deer browsing and invasive species, next slide, sorry, are altering forest floor and subcanopy structure and composition. And so such a dramatic change in the understory of these forests allows us to hypothesize that maybe birds that specifically nest in and use these habitats would be declining disproportionately to those birds that use other habitats in the forest. because this is the habitat that's being most greatly impacted by deer browsing and invasive plant species. Next slide. And so what we did is that we used USGS breeding bird surveys to calculate abundance trends estimates for forest species in New Jersey from 1980 to 2005. And so we used only routes that were deemed consistent by the USGS analysts, and we only included species that had at least 14 samples for the period of the analysis. And so this resulted in a trend analysis for 22 species. And so once we had these 22 species, we categorized all the species depending on their breeding habitat, so either canopy, mid-canopy, or shrub and ground breeders. And we used the Birds of North America online to gather this information. And so what we can see in our results, next slide, is that there are 6 species that have a negative trend. And so the black-billed cuckoo, rose-breasted grosbeak, yellow-billed cuckoo, veery, wood thrush, and ovenbird are all significantly decreasing over the period from 1980 to 2005. And we can also see that these are all shrub and ground and mid-story nesting birds. And the 2 birds that are increasing significantly are the tufted titmouse and the red-bellied woodpecker. And those are both canopy nesting birds. Next slide. And so when we look at this graphically, we can see that, so the y-axis is a percentage, and so if there's a point next to the 5, then this species increased by 5% per year over the period of record. And so if it's a -5, then this species has increased negatively by 5% over the course per year over the course of the period from 1980 to 2005. And so the large circles represent significant declines or increases, and the small circles are just, trends, but that are not significant. And again, we can see that the mid-story and the shrub and ground birds are the ones that are declining, whereas the canopy birds are the ones that are significantly increasing. There are no mid-story birds or shrub and ground birds that are significantly increasing, and there are no canopy birds that are significantly decreasing. Next slide. And so, but then again, what we have here is just a simple correlational analysis on a broad scale. We have no way found the causes of decline for forest songbirds in New Jersey. We just put together some things that we were seeing at our sites and reviewed some literature on deer populations and invasive plants, specifically Microstygium, and correlated them to what guild of birds we thought would be most affected by this. So what we started to do is ground truth the results for the broad scale pattern we observed. And so this is after the paper. The paper just in biological invasions just includes the broad scale analysis and is more of a review of something that we wanted people to pay attention to. And so we started kind of ground truthing this in some recent research we've been doing with breeding bird spot mapping at Hutcheson Memorial Forest, the forest that I showed you earlier. Next slide. So what we did here was we established a grid over the entire old growth woods, and we walk alternating grid lines marking the location of singing males on a spot map. And so we compile maps over the course of the breeding season to establish territories. So basically what we do is we have a sheet like the one you see before you for every survey that we do, and we mark where we hear singing males from. And so when we compile these maps on top of each other, we can see that, oh, between D4 and C4, for 15 out of our 19 surveys, we had a male wood thrush singing there. There must be a territory there. And so we can get an idea of how many breeding pairs there are within the old woods at HMF. And then our goal was to compare this to past breeding bird data at HMF. Next slide. And so these are some very rough results. It's just from 1 year of our study. We're continuing it. And so there's a lot of confounding variables in here. But what I want you to pay attention to is the ovenbird, which in 1973 there were 31 breeding pairs. In 2007 there were 4. And the wood thrush, where in 1973 there were 43 breeding pairs, and in 2007 there were 11. And so these are both the dominant shrub and ground birds that used to be in the forest And the 1973 data is from LEC 1975, a paper that was in the Hutcheson Memorial Forest Journal. And they estimated that ground foraging insectivores accounted for 40% of avian biomass in 1973. And we can see that there's been a great decline in these two ground shrub and ground nesting species. Some other interesting things in here is the decline of the gray catbird, which is the fourth bird in the list, as well as the eastern towhee. But those might be confounded by the fact that the successional fields that are along the edge of the forest have changed dramatically since 1973. And so those birds, the catbird and the towhee, are not strictly forest birds, and they're more edge birds. Another interesting thing to look at is that the flickers and downy woodpeckers have decreased a lot, and the red-bellied woodpecker increased. But the main point to take from this now is that there's been a drastic decline in ovenbirds and wood thrush, and these used to be the most dominant shrub and ground nesting birds in the forest. Next slide. And so to bring it all together, declines in bird populations may be in part due to a more subtle process than the usual suspects. And so normally the literature is filled with declining birds and increases in nest predation due to fragmentation, increases in cowbird parasitism, and as well as loss of wintering grounds in neotropics. But a more subtle process, such as an invader and an overabundant herbivore, can change certain aspects of the forest that could also compound these other problems for breeding songbirds. But to really understand what's going on in these forests, we need long-term experimental data to tease out the relative strength and possible interactions of overbrowsing and invasive plants on birds. And so after thinking about this, I finally realized, that working on plants does make a lot of sense and is a lot easier to set up experimental plots to test out these things, because to understand the effect that it has on birds, we basically need a whole bunch of Hutcheson Memorial Forests, and we need a fully replicated experiment that has certain replicates that have, that keep deer out so that have fences but have the invasives, other ones that have all the invasives taken out and have no deer, and then some that are controlled that have both deer and both invasives. And so I'm sure many of you know that, keeping a fence together around a 26-hectare forest or removing all the invasives from a 26-hectare forest is rather unfeasible. So that it's really difficult to kind of tease these things apart and see, is there an interaction, or is it just individually, overbrowsing and invasive plants are negatively affecting birds. One possible way to do it is to just look at the invertebrate community and assume that this largely affects the breeding birds. So you could do that on a smaller scale and see how the invertebrate community changes when you have deer and invasive plants present, just deer present, or just invasive plant present, or if you keep all of them out. This could be a way to kind of get at a more unwieldy question than setting aside all these huge tracts of forests and having a huge manipulation, which would take a lot of effort, although which I of course would love to do. Another possibility is that deforestation is happening from the bottom up, and so this isn't a new idea. Several researchers have thought about this, and that's the idea that as the older trees in the forest die, what is going to be there to replace them? If we have invasive plant species, if we have Japanese silkgrass outcompeting native seedlings, what is going to grow up in that gap? Is it going to be ailanthus, the tree of heaven, or is this going to be other invasive plant species? And how then will this affect birds in the canopy? So we could just be witnessing the beginning of drastic changes to eastern deciduous forests, and bird populations as well as larger trees could be next as the process goes on. And so it's clear that we need to understand complex interactions in order to manage our natural resources, and it's not enough just to leave aside large, beautiful tracts of land and expect them to manage it themselves, because Hutcheson Memorial Forest is an example of that. Is a beautiful old-growth forest that was left to manage itself, and it now is teetering on the edge of disaster. And so it's the main purpose of our research is to kind of get this idea out there That's about all. So I just want to thank Troy and Leslie for inviting me to speak again, and thank all of you for having patience with my inability to use technology. Also like to thank Hutcheson Memorial Forest Research Funding and Biological Invasion for inviting the paper. And I'll take any questions that any of you may have.
Okay. This is Leslie, and it's just it's not a question. I just accidentally forgot to give your introduction, Ben, at the beginning. So I'll just say really quickly, Ben is a fifth-year PhD student at Rutgers University studying in Dr. Julie Lockwood's lab, and he's interested, obviously now, he knows, in integrating invasion ecology with community ecology, and his dissertation he is defending in August, and he is a fifth-year student at Rutgers. So